Okay, everybody, just a short video here about impact factors of journals, just to give a little bit of information about them. And then I've got some PDF files in the document section in D2L that are articles. I figure the experts can speak about it better than I can. That I've asked you to read. So most of the information on this you'll probably get from those articles, but I want to give you just a little bit of a background. So what's an impact factor of a journal? Well, we have a faculty member in the math department. I shall not name their name, but some faculty, let's just say it like that, won't submit journal articles to a journal unless they have a high impact factor. And you'll see this abbreviated as IF, or sometimes it'll say journal impact factor. And of course you'll see that abbreviated JIF. I think some people just like JIF, like to be able to say JIF instead of if. I don't know what the difference is, but so they like to, different people like to abbreviate in different ways. You'll see it in different ways in different articles, so just so you know that's out there. Okay, so anyway, some people just won't do it. So how does that work? Well, mostly these are scientific journals, but they're not all. The reason why, I think, is because it's kind of a mathy way of calculating things, mostly. And I think that the humanities journals just don't really feel like you can stamp a number on their stuff and call it good. Whereas math and science people tend to be more like, yeah, give me a number. You know, it makes more sense to me if I have a number. Okay, I've got a 5, that person only has a 2, 5 is greater than 2, so therefore this must be a better journal, okay? And that's not always true, but a lot of times people kind of take it that way. So how does it work? That's the question. What you do, and I'll give you an example. This is 2020, right? So if I wanted to find an impact factor in a mathy journal that's a pretty impressive journal if you can get published into, is called the Notices, okay? So if I want the impact factor for the Notices for 2020, then what I would do is I would look at a 2-year rotation, and I would say, okay, how many articles were published and in those 2 years, so that would be 2018 to 2019. Okay, and then I would say how many of those articles were referenced. Okay, so how many citations did they get? Okay, and then in the following year. So how many citations? If you go and you look at other articles that are published, so say there's one in 2018 that was Webster's article, whatever, on after-school tutoring, okay, and it was published in 2018, and then in 2020, somebody referenced my article. They cited it and put it into their journal article and used it as one of their references. Okay, so if that's so, then that would count. So now what we do is we take a ratio of these two. Okay, and the idea is that if the number of references is high, then we'll be able to look at that ratio, and it'll be a different number than what we're getting for other articles in the same area. Now the interesting thing is this. Let me back up just a second. This is, so it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, that journal that notices it's got an impact factor of 2.5, it must be amazing. Because there could be other journals in other areas that have reference factors or impact factors of 5.0. Okay, so it doesn't make sense to do that. First, you must group the journals by area of study. Okay, so if this is some math teacher, I don't know, and this is JRME, Journal of Research in Math Education, and this is the notices, okay, which those aren't really the same, because notices is very, very mathy, and these other two are very, very math ed. But just for funsies, let's just say that we are comparing between those three, and those are all journals in the same basic area of study, which is math. Then if notices had a 5 and JRME only had a 3.5, then we can say, okay, the notices has a higher impact factor than JRME. But it's got to be comparative, if that makes sense. Comparing. And it just doesn't make sense if I compare, I don't know if this is even a journal. I'm sorry if it's not. If I compare notices, their impact factor with physicists today, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense because they're probably different categories. They're probably got different readers, different people who would cite them. There are some overlaps. Clearly, math and physics have a lot in common, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to compare those two to one another. They really need to be the same, similar areas, okay? So that's kind of the idea behind it. Now, there's a lot of controversy, I'm going to tell you. Let me move this out of the way. Controversy about impact factors. IF and JIF. And that's one of the articles that you're going to read, is all about why maybe we should just move on from this idea. This idea, by the way, started around the 1970s. I think it was like don't quote me on this date, 75, and it's still going on today. So, I mean, it's been like 40-something years, right? And people are still using it, almost 50 years. And people are still using this process. And they're just like, oh, you know, this is the way we always do it. Like I said, some faculty members are hardcore about this. Oh, you got to have a good impact factor or it's not worth it. In today's world where it's publish or perish, if you're in a tenure track faculty position, excuse me, some departments won't even consider what they consider inferior journals. Okay, now there's a lot of controversy about this because who says that's an inferior journal? Just because it's not cited as often. Maybe it's a more unique journal, or maybe it's got more prestigious stuff, or you know, maybe it's got a certain area that it's looking at, but it doesn't mean that it's not as important or that it's inferior. So, and in particular in humanities, they don't really love this idea of rankings, right? Rankings can be, although it is a numeric number, subjective, based on the comparison of different journals. Okay, so that can be very difficult for people to deal with. So one of the journals talks about, well, one of the articles I put up for you talks about what it is. What is an impact factor? They give you a better way of calculating. They give you the process and the whole thing. Some impact factors, they actually can be complicated, some of the formulas, but the basic formula is there in one of them. I also put an editorial into your D2L that gives you just kind of what do we think about impact factors and in general. There's also one in there about how some people have had a movement to modify impact factors. Okay, maybe if we, for instance, a lot of times this is an average, right? So this is taking the average number of times an article was cited. And there are a lot of people who say, well, it's an average, but this isn't normal data, okay? And if you're a stats person, then you know that that's kind of a no-no. So it's not normal data, so why would we take an average? Maybe instead we should take a median. Does that make more statistical sense? So we find the guy that's in the middle, that's the teeter-totter point, right? That's what a median is instead of averaging it. We find the guy that's right in the middle, that's really in the middle. Okay, so there's one for how to modify it, and then there's one article that says maybe it's just time to move on. And I actually like that article. So you'll see in some of this stuff, sometimes there's a little bit of elitism that happens in higher education where people are like, oh, if you don't publish in such and such, then you're just not a good publisher, basically. You're not a good article writer. Well, some people just don't care about that stuff, so it doesn't matter. Now, if you're going to be in a tenure track position, remember from the very first of this class, we've talked about in a tenure track position, you need to publish or perish, and that means either writing, submitting, and getting published journal articles. That's the number one thing for getting tenure, or grant writing, right? A lot of schools will allow grant writing to take the place of journal articles because they really want you to bring money into the institution, right? So those two things are really important for the tenure process. Okay, so as we look at that, sorry, it's bugging me. Anyway, as we look at that idea of impact factor, what I would like for you to do is go back. Remember, you've already told me a journal that you would like to be published in, right? Okay, so go back and find your journal and see if you can find its impact factor. Now, this isn't something that you're turning in. This is not for a grade. I just want you to look at it and see, oh, I really like that journal, and I thought it was an impressive journal, and I want to know what kind of impact factor it's been given, just so that you can see, is this considered a really researchy thing? A lot of the math education ones will not be high impact factors, and the reason for that is that they're more math ed instead of more math. And so it's a more specific target area, and so you're only going to normally be other teachers, right? It's not all mathematicians who are looking at that math education kind of research. So just so you know, go back and look, see if you can find your impact factor for your journal. It'll be on the funsies, and I think that's it. All right, so go read those articles, please. All right, have a good one. Thanks.